So is that coming through okay?
Yeah.
Yes, we're fine. Thank you.
Okay. So I would say so obviously it'll be in English. Do you want to translate anything as I go, or is everyone okay with English?
It's okay. It's okay.
Is it okay? Okay. All right. Okay, so what I wanted to share was this month is the 5th anniversary of the first workshop that happened in Munich based around the book. And I wanted to share some ideas and a few stories of companies that have been using these ideas and customizing it to their environments, and share a little bit of data and also some new ideas for what is going to be coming with the next kind of iteration. So this all started from a conversation that I had in an organization where the PMO director brought me into his office and said, I was working as a Scrum Master on one of the teams, and he said, we want to run this project as an Agile project, but we don't want Agile to get in the way. And that didn't make a lot of sense to me at the time. And then what I realized was he was the guy that actually was going to get in trouble if anything went wrong with the project. So it started to get me thinking about all of these different ideas around how Agile affects the entire organization. And this was the blog post that I wrote back then that started me thinking about these ideas and how do we if organizations really want to become more agile, then we should figure out how to do that in an agile way, instead of what would normally happen is we try to plan this big 2-3 year long agile transformation and then only to find out that it didn't really work the way that we thought. So that inspired a video tutorial series. And are people familiar with Coaching Agile Teams by Lisa Adkins? She wrote the book Coaching Agile Teams, and her and I launched these live lessons at the same time. So we created these video tutorials for Pearson Education, and it was all around how do we try to help our organizations transform in an agile way. And this was originally supposed to be the first book. So Pearson Education had approached me to write a book because at the time, this was back in 2010 or 2011, no one was really writing about how to approach agile transformation in an agile way. So it ended up turning into these live lessons, and that again got me thinking about just different ideas, a better way to approach change in our organizations. And then the first version was released chapter by chapter. And the intent of it was just to tell a story. So there was kind of no intent for it to turn out the way that it did. I just thought it was an interesting story because the team I was working with were coming up with some really cool ideas and applying lean startup concepts. And what excited me about that was while I was working as a product owner in an organization, I used the lean startup method to launch a new suite of mobile products for this company. And the last product that they had launched, they spent about $1.5 million in 18 months building this thing, and nobody bought it. We literally did not sell one license. So taking the lean startup approach was something that just felt like the right thing to do. And then the yellow book was rewritten when the ideas, all of these different ideas started to come together. And it was kind of inspired from Management 3.0 and Jürgen Apollo, who has what he calls the mojito method. So if you haven't had a mojito, you should. They're delicious. But the point is the individual ingredients themselves are not so good, but when you put them together, it creates something awesome. So the idea was to take these different ideas from the Agile world, from lean startup, from change management, from neuroscience, and put it all together so people can create their own approach to change. So when it was released, we used a website called Indiegogo, which is like Kickstarter, basically. And the producer of the book put a package up there that said, hey, if you subscribe to be the godfather for this campaign, then you could organize the first workshop. And there wasn't one at the time. So somebody subscribed, a fellow named Torsten Scheller in Munich, Germany, subscribed to be the godfather and invited me over there to run the first workshop. And this month is the 5th anniversary of these workshops. And I built it in very much a lean startup type of approach, which was rapid feedback, rapid iteration, to try to find something that could take the ideas from a book and kind of turn that into a workshop, which was pretty interesting because if you can see one of the pictures, the big picture in the middle, there's right in the middle, there's the number 2 on a sticky note. So somebody just really hated that part of the course for some reason. And I remember them asking, they said, doesn't that make you feel bad? Like, look, there's some 2s on there and 3s. And I said, well, no, that's the best way to learn. You can fail faster to succeed sooner. So since then, there's been 350 workshops worldwide in 28 different countries. And what I've been doing over those 5 years is collecting patterns. So collecting what are problems that people are having out in the real world? Where are they getting stuck with change? And that leads to an exercise I call the change challenge. And people, whether they're coming from HR or from Agile coaching or from change management, they all have very similar problems. It's not related to, are we doing Agile the right way? Are we doing this practice the right way? It's very much, how do we get our leadership aligned around a direction? How do we help and support our organization move to a better way of working? And by collecting all of this data, it gave me some patterns. So what is it that people wanted out of these ideas? And modern tools and skills were one. So particularly from, I guess, what you would call the traditional change management world. So people coming from more project management-based thinking, wanting to learn what Agile and Lean is, and how do we take that and how do we apply that to helping our organizations change. A big chunk around alignment and co-creation. How do we approach change a different way so we don't have to sell it? How do we avoid having to get buy-in and overcome resistance by involving the people in the change, in the design of the change, who ultimately have to live with the consequence? And the majority of people who have attended come from a change management background, I would say, and a close second would be the Agile coaches. So it's really interesting to get both different perspectives in the room at the same time. So people who come from an Agile background already kind of work this way in the first place, but once they move into the organizational layer and they're looking at really complex change, they're missing the things that change management brings. And change management's kind of the opposite. They're missing a lot of the really good facilitation, coaching, and other types of Agile practices and skills, but they bring some of that more organizational view. So it's really cool getting people in a room together to share their experiences and ideas. And I wanted to go through a couple of stories. And the point is that our brains don't handle uncertainty very well. So we'd like to feel certain with where we're going or what it is that we're doing. And a lot of the times, especially in the change world, they try to come up with standards. So if we had a step-by-step standardized process that worked every single time, and people were robots, then there'd be no resistance and all of our change would work. But change doesn't really work that way. So all of the examples and stories are from people that said, we kind of took this one idea, we started here, and then we just decided to change this. A canvas didn't make sense, or I didn't like that question. But they still used the same premise that if they bring people into the conversation before they decide the implementation for the change, it's more likely to work. And the first story is from an organization, a government organization that was implementing SAP, a 3-year-long system implementation. And the first thing that we did was to try to make sense of the current state. So that diagram on the screen won't make sense to anyone. But for the people who created it, for them, it was exploring the ecosystem. So we weren't focused on how do we implement this system and train people and coach them in their new roles and all this type of stuff. It was, what is it about this environment that we know and we need to know in order to move forward one small step next week. So it was just a completely different perspective. And we just explored who's affected by this change, what's the leadership like, who's most likely to support this, what's changing and for who. And that turned into a much more simple diagram, which for the Agile folks in the room, you might have heard the term tracer bullet or doing a thin vertical slice through your technology. So instead of building your technology layer by layer, you do one thin slice through it, and then you can kind of de-risk your design and your architecture. So we wanted to take that same approach, but towards change. Is there one department we can start with that we can launch, 20% of the functionality that gets us 80% of the benefit in one small place, which is kind of unheard of if you've ever worked with SAP, because ultimately 8,000 people would be affected by this change. And they knew that if they spent 3 years doing it and launching it, it wasn't going to work. So the second picture is around how we developed a change network. And the reason was the hiring managers would be the people that would probably be impacted the most by this change. So the worst thing we could do is, as change agents, is to kind of step over management and go to the people directly. So we wanted to enlist those hiring managers as the change champions. So we created personas. We created personas about all the different departments and the different groups, and decided on what would make the most sense to get started with. And that led to the simplest experiment that could possibly work. Now, for these guys, they said, we're not going to do a change canvas. That doesn't make any sense because we already bought SAP. We already have all the funding for it. We've signed on the implementation partners. It's going to happen anyway. We have, kind of high-level phases that we're going to go through. So this thing's already going to happen. So there's no point in talking about what you normally would do with a strategy canvas. So we put that stuff up on a wall and started inviting stakeholders to talk in front of it once a week. And the benefit that the program lead said was it showed people how hard it was going to be. So often there's the idea of what is called the hole in the floor approach to change. So the people at the top will take something and they'll drop it through a hole in the floor and then go, okay, you guys go figure that stuff out. And then they come back a couple of months later and they go, why isn't everything different? This big visible wall helped bring those stakeholders in sooner so they could actually see how hard it was and they could see progress a lot faster. And then the ultimate, compliment is he said, I'm positive things would not have been in as good shape if we haven't, or it wouldn't have gone as smoothly without the lean change principles that we talked about early on. So the key was that program lead. He was really energized about trying to run this in a different way. And he also said that people thought they were crazy. They were spending so much time on change management. But in the end, it worked out because they started from a good place. They started from who's affected by this, how do we bring them into the process sooner, and then they customized their implementation to suit their environment. So anyone who's worked in government knows that change is slow and it's more difficult than if you're working in a media company. So it was something that was quite innovative for them. Even the big visible wall was pretty funny because people wouldn't walk by it. It was such a foreign concept to the people in that government organization that they would look at this thing and they wouldn't even know what to do. They weren't sure if they were supposed to walk by it, if they were allowed to look at it and ask questions and stuff. It was such a drastic change, but it's a really simple thing to do. And it's kind of what every Agile coach does already. But for them, it was all brand new to them. So the program manager, who was the one who was really energized to do this, we started with him and who he was. And often when we look at methods like change methods or Agile methods, we look at the tool, the framework, the method, and we look at the principles that the method has. But those frameworks, they don't have principles. People have principles. So we always have to start where we are as a change agent, because if you're authentic and you're genuine, people will listen. If they know you're coming from a place of trying to coerce or trying to manipulate, or saying things that you don't really believe, you're going to have a lot more of a challenge trying to get people to adopt a change. So you have to come from where you are. So the patterns that I've seen over the last 5 years was when there's a change agent that doesn't put their title or their favorite method in front of them. They lead with themselves. And then from there, they attach mental models. Mental models are just how do we view the world? So do you see yourself as a change manager who controls things? Do you see yourself as a coach, as a facilitator? How do you see yourself, and how does that help you interact with the rest of the world around you? So you have to start with who you are, the models you use to make sense of the world, and then put the tools and practices on top of that. So the way that a lot of these tools and techniques get implemented with some of the other stories I'm going to show you is based on the people who are using them. And a really good example is, I'm sure people have been to an open space before. So just raise your hand if you've been to an open space. So a couple. Yep. And, I go to a lot of events in the Agile world and in the change world, and it's just really interesting to see how different the mindsets and the approaches are. So on the left-hand side is, if you go to an Agile event, the open spaces, they're facilitated. There's paper on the floor, people write down what they want to talk about, they put it on the wall, they build the agenda. And on the right-hand side, I was at another traditional change conference, and they said, we're going to do this really innovative thing, this innovative conversation thing. We're going to create these open spaces. And in that corner, Bill is going to be the moderator, and you guys are going to talk about this. And then they had the moderators drive the conversations. So what they thought was open space and a way to do dialogue was just basically one person deciding what to talk about and telling people what they're supposed to talk about. And the funny part was I did my talk after that session. So I went up and I said, okay, well, here's, if you really want to understand how to apply Agile and Lean practices and change management, think of these two scenarios. If this was an Agile event, there'd be a bunch of sticky notes over there. People would figure it out. They'll make the whole agenda from nothing and go. But here, it was controlled. It was decided ahead of time what the organizers wanted you guys to talk about, and it was directed. So you're using the same tool as in an open space, but what you believe is driving how you implement that. So we can't start with a tool because that will get misinterpreted. If we start with who we are, we can at least kind of come from a place of authenticity. So I didn't want what happened over the last 5 years to turn into yet another framework, because there's 10 million of them out there and we don't really need anymore. So if you Google change management frameworks or Agile frameworks, you're easily going to find a few million hits. So enough of that stuff exists already. So what if we looked at change a different way? What if we looked at thinking of change as a series of interventions where we run experiments and we try to move things forward a little bit at a time? We don't worry about having an 18-month roadmap or a big change plan, because our organizations didn't get there with that same type of thinking. Organizations that are going through an Agile transformation or a digital transformation, I don't think they had a Gantt chart like this where they intentionally wanted to create all these layers of management or create all of this heavyweight process where people couldn't get stuff done. It just kind of happened. I've been in so many organizations where if production goes offline, then they get everybody in a room and they yell at each other for a few days. They get production back up, they go back to their desks. So that's the ritual that they go through. And it's based on fear, and it's based on blame, and it's just based on things that get us to a state where our organizations now start to look at Agile because we can't work that way anymore. But it wasn't intentionally designed. So we can't intentionally design our way back to a different state of working. We've got to think about it as a series of interventions over time. And it's things like, you know, whenever events happen in our organizations, like production goes down, or if something goes wrong, what is it that we do? We create a new process. If a project doesn't execute on time, we create another set of processes or documents that people have to follow. And then all that stuff just builds up, and then we wake up one day and we can't get anything done. So it's those are the events where we have the opportunity to start to change those things. So if we looked at some ideas from how actually change happens in our societies, there's always some need or some trigger for change, and then things start to emerge. So if you're interested in models in psychology, this is the work of Herbert Blumer, and he talks about social change theory, which is basically whenever people are upset with the status quo or they don't like the way things work, somebody takes action. So if there's anybody in the room that is involved in, you know, a local charity or a church community or something like that, it's very action-based. Somebody wants to change something and they take action, and they start to find people who have the same passion. And then the change starts to emerge. It's very unstructured, it's very informal, and often Agile transformations start the same way. It could be there's one person who is kind of the Agile coach in their spare time, but it's not their title. And they kind of go around and they help people with this Agile stuff. And then eventually it starts to coalesce, which is the second bubble there. And that's when we feel we need to put a little bit more structure into things. So we might need some lightweight process. We might need to get into a certain set of rituals where we're doing, you know, a weekly stand-up, for example, something like that. But then we can take it too far and we can over formalize it, and we get into bureaucratization. And I see that with a lot of the large banks here in Canada that, you know, some of them, they have an Agile COE with 5 levels of hierarchy in it. There's, you know, Scrum Masters, coaches, senior coaches, managers, directors, VP of Agile, and they're implementing Agile using the old values of the organization. They're not using the Agile values to try to. So once you get into bureaucratization, it just means that the movement's ready to decline. And that could mean that in a lot of cases, a lot of the things that you did worked, but you didn't recognize it. So I see thousands of successes with all organizations I've been in, but they're so small or they feel like they're insignificant, and we just kind of sweep them under the rug and say, well, we didn't get this huge transformational success, therefore nothing worked. Decline can also mean that the change was just too hard and we went back to the old way of working. Or, you know, in the case of that Agile COE that had 5 levels of hierarchy in it, we chose to try to transform to a new state using our old existing values instead of the new ones that we say we want. And then at the bottom of the hill is the intervention. And for me, what I see in large organizations is that that's when they fire the first consulting firm and they hire somebody else. So usually 12 to 18 months is the tolerance with some of the large organizations here. They'll bring in consulting company A, they'll give them 12 months to 18 months, and then they fire them, and then they bring somebody else in. And then the cycle keeps repeating itself. I mean, most of the large organizations here in Canada, they've been transforming for 10 years because they're going through this wave. And every single time it's the same. Let's bring a new framework in, let's bring a new consulting firm, let's push it out from a centralized place, and then it doesn't work, and then they start all over again. And there's lots of little successes along the way, but it's still a pattern. And it follows the exact same way that social change happens. So kind of taking into account that, plus some of the data collected over the last 5 years, this is an example from a company called National Leasing, and they are a large equipment leasing company in Canada. And the change person there, she had no change or agile experience. She just kind of stumbled upon the book and said, maybe I could use this canvas. So she just emailed me out of the blue and said, hey, can I talk to you for half an hour? And, if I wanted to do this, what would I do? And she said what happened here was that it helped the managers take ownership of the change, which was the key thing, because the expectation is always, if you're the change person or the agile coach, it's you. You are the one who owns the change, but that's not what it is. It has to be the people who have ownership over the work. They have to be the people leading the change, and us as agile coaches or change managers, we're facilitating and coaching and supporting. So she said some of the teams, they created their canvas and then never looked at it again, and others, they used it continually. So they constantly had conversations in front of it, and the key was putting it in a big public area. This is their main hallway in their corporate head office, so everybody could see what was going on. So it was different, excuse me, from the last story I told. They started somewhere different. So the idea of just giving people freedom of choice. What's the most important thing I can do right now in the context of this change to move it one step forward instead of trying to come up with a series of steps? There's a link there as well that has a podcast with her. So I did an interview with her a couple of times along this 2-year change. And she said when the system went live, 97% of the people felt that they were ready to go live because of the approach that they took, because they made it about inclusiveness and diversity, and they brought people into the conversation. And she said something really awesome that stuck with me is the people who write the plan don't fight the plan. It was really cool. This was a story from a media company, and the change they wanted to make was to figure out a different structure to work within. And by structure, that means the structure of their team. So where they're located, departments, how departments collaborate with each other. And they wanted to do a Lego Serious Play thing to explore it. And then they told me that they had somebody who was remote. And so I just packed up one of the kits and I mailed it to her. She was 2 time zones away. And the picture there is the model that they came up with. And you won't be able to see what she built in the iPad there, but the people in the room built that bridge. They connected it to the iPad, and then 2 time zones away, she built the rest of the bridge in her office and joined it together. And the idea was that it really doesn't matter where we are. We can collaborate with anyone from anywhere. And it was really cool because people said I was crazy for trying to do a remote Lego Serious Play thing. They said, it's impossible. You can't do that. People have to be in the room. That's against the Lego Serious Play rules. But the best way for me to do something is for somebody to tell me I can't do it. So it was great. The energy and the way that they included this remote person and didn't forget about them was outstanding. But again, it didn't start from let's create a strategy and a change canvas about why we want to do this change. It started from, we just want to explore. We want to see what it would look like if we work together in a different way. And the last one was doing a day-and-a-half long intervention with a large organization where we had 200 people from 4 different countries get together and ran a big Lego Serious Play thing where they talked about let's build a model that describes a future where our company doesn't have these 3 big problems. So the CEO and the CTO went on stage and talked about the context. So they opened up the story. And then we had 200 people, so 17 teams, all creating models based on the trying to design the future of the organization where these 3 problems didn't exist anymore. And each of the 17 teams did their own change canvas. So each of them had a little 1-pager. They went up on stage and we recorded videos of it. And they said, okay, well, here's the problem we picked. This is the future we see. Here's the 3 experiments I'm taking away. And all 17 teams went up on stage and did that. we came back 6 months later and did a retrospective and looked at, well, which canvases got done, which ones didn't, what happened. And that was a rhythm or a heartbeat that we got into. So every year there was a new summit exploring a different aspect of the transformation that this company was going on. And last year it was really cool because it was a Star Wars theme and I got to dress up as a Jedi and I got to dye my hair blue and stuff like that. The head of transformation actually dressed up as Yoda. So it was kind of a fun, cool company anyway, which you kind of wouldn't associate necessarily with a bank, but the approach was different. The approach here was they felt it was really important to just keep in a rhythm. You know, let's do these summits every year. Let's do these quarterly rituals. Let's do these half a year retrospectives, and let's kind of get into a groove and not try to look too far ahead, because these guys recognized it was going to be 10 years for their transformation right at the start. So their main shareholder invested €1 billion in their transformation, and the time and the effort to do things like this. I remember the first year I asked them, I said, you guys must be spending a lot of money to bring all these people here to do this session. And they didn't see it that way. They saw it as an investment, which was really cool. If you are interested in the underlying model that these guys applied, it was called Theory U by Otto Sharma. And it's basically a very deep model. Instead of trying to continually improve your way to a new state in a superficial way, Theory U says, we have to strip away all the assumptions about why we exist. We have to get past the process and agile transformation and all the superficial stuff and really get down to the core of why we exist as an organization. And that's what Theory U is all about. And Theory U is all about the heartbeat as well. That's what they call it. They call it a regular heartbeat. So combining all these different ideas from these different models, because this is truly what the head of transformation believed, was really fantastic. And the last thing about this story was the change team was a mix of HR people, agile coaches, change managers, consultants, and managers. So there was a really wide, diverse set of perspective. So all these different stories, plus the 5 years of data from workshops, was telling me that there's kind of a pattern of 5 really important things that great companies take advantage of when they're trying to evolve themselves and to become better. And one of them is that they have a higher sense of purpose. So they value a cause and purpose more so than urgency for change. And for those who might not have heard of it, urgency for change is step number 1 of Kotter's 8-step change model. So if you don't have urgency, change won't happen. But urgency is it's a stressful word for starters. And it doesn't really, Kotter warns a lot about false urgency. And that's often what we see. We get, leaders saying, we have to do this, we have to transform, and they push and they create stress. And it's, the success stories I've seen are more when people feel a sense of purpose. They believe what the organization is doing. They love the people, and it's coming from a different place. The next thing is they value meaningful dialogue. So the last story I told, where we did the Star Wars themed intervention, the CEO would do lean coffees with 50 people once a week. But it was the CEO facilitating. He would sit there and listen, and he knew if people were holding back, if he's asking about problems and, what are people on the ground seeing when they're trying to get work done. And he knew that they were trying to be politically correct or they were too afraid to speak up. He'd pull it out of them. He would say, no, I want to hear it. And if I'm the problem, tell me I'm the problem. So very open, honest, meaningful dialogue instead of just, sending out a bunch of email newsletters and communication plans. And that pattern was the same everywhere. I've also seen it the opposite. I've seen it where, companies will do a town hall, but the messages are all scripted. So you might have a C-level executive on stage and they're just saying whatever the communications person wrote down for them. And in one case, in one large organization, they showed the Spotify videos, you know, those whiteboard videos talking about the Spotify model and stuff like that. And the first question the CIO got asked was, will we be allowed to wear jeans now? So just totally not anywhere near something that was meaningful. It was just scripted and it didn't really mean anything. So the organizations that really move forward encourage meaningful dialogue, even when it's, you know, painful to do so. I've never been a believer that resistance to change is a thing, because it's kind of like saying, if I'm the change person and I think all of you people are resisting, all I'm doing is blaming you when I don't understand what's going on. So instead of coming from a place of how do we overcome resistance because people aren't doing what I'm telling them to, the best that we can do is see how they respond to change. If it's an extremely negative reaction, it could be, maybe it's not the right time, maybe it's the wrong change, but that's information telling you that something isn't right. So instead of fighting the resistance, get curious. Try to understand what's happening for people, because there's a lot more going on than just the change in the organization. I finished a workshop in Toronto this week, and we talked a lot about the mental health epidemic in the world, but in Canada specifically, 1 in 4 have anxiety or depression just because of how the world is today. And people have got other stuff going on. You know, if you have an Apple device, open up the Screen Time app, and it will show you how many times people are trying to get your attention. And this week, I've had about 1,048 messages pop up on this phone. That's Slack, email, messaging, WhatsApp, Instagram, Facebook, everything. So that's 1,000 people trying to get my attention in just 1 week. So people have other stuff going on. They're not resisting change because they're bad people. They're busy, they're stressed out. So sometimes we have to sort of let change take its course and give people a bit of a break once in a while. The fourth one is obviously co-creation, which, you know, I remember I asked this at another meetup. I said, so imagine I'm the expert in designing kitchens, and I come into your house and I start rearranging your kitchen. What would you do? And the group said something, muerte, something, which meant that if I came into their kitchen and did that, they would kill me. So it became, you know, it got through to them in the sense that we might be the change experts, but don't come in my kitchen and mess things up. Don't try to sell me something I don't want. I need to be involved in doing this change. So we value co-creation as opposed to creating this plan and trying to push it out for people to follow. If we have to get buy-in, we're not starting from a place of curiosity. And then finally, obviously running experiments over just executing change activities. And this one's fairly obvious. You know, running experiments has, it's very popular. Everywhere you read on LinkedIn or Twitter is about experimentation mindset and how we have to run experiments and experiments and experiments. And in some cases, it's almost become an excuse to not be thoughtful or to do any planning at all. So it's kind of, how do we balance experiments? If we have extreme uncertainty, we need small, short experiments. If our change is just to move a bunch of printers, we don't have to run experiments. But we don't want to get into the trap of just checking off tasks in a change program. We really want to develop that experimentation mindset. And we put all these things together. It kind of looks like Voltron a little bit, where we're bolting on pieces as we need them. So instead of having a standard or, you know, a step-by-step plan, start from where you are and then add practices that make sense. I've been in some organizations, especially telecoms or capital market groups within banks, that the cultures are quite hostile. So a kind of a pull-based co-creation stance usually doesn't work at the start because people are used to things being handed down from the top to the bottom, or they're used to this push-based approach to change. So you might have to push a little bit to start, but then you can back off, because if you take a stance that's too opposite of what the culture is, it won't respond at all. And getting a natural pushback is better than getting no reaction at all. So you can think of it as these 5 dimensions being patterns over the last 5 years that seem to matter more for organizations that were having success with change. And the difference was how they used modified practices or different practices, tools, and techniques kind of along the way. So that's what is probably coming by the fall of this year, is an update to the first book and the ideas around what really makes change successful. And it's definitely not when we have a standard linear step-by-step approach to change. So finding balance is the key. How do we balance these 2 dimensions? You can kind of think of it like the Agile Manifesto, right? It says working software over comprehensive documentation. But it doesn't say don't document anything anymore. It says use your brain. People want software more. But if you need to document stuff, at least make sure it's useful. So it's kind of the same thing, is how do we balance the teeter-totter and try to build the right approach towards change in our organizations. So the approach should be as simple as possible. It shouldn't get in the way. If the tools in the process get in the way, it's not the right tool and or process. Add missing pieces. I mean, there's liberating structures. There's all of the David Rock's work with the SCARF model in neuroscience. There is visual facilitation. There's Management 3.0, innovation games, Lego Serious Play. There's so many tools and practices and ideas that align with these 5 dimensions. Pick the ones that make the most sense. I think only once I had an executive team refuse to use Lego with Lego Serious Play. So I brought the stuff out and immediately was, no, put that away, we're not doing it. And I thought, wow, what a great group. Must be fun to party with these guys. But it just wasn't for them. They wanted something that was a little more conservative, which was fine. So remove anything that's not valuable. Just get rid of that waste because it's just going to make your lives a lot more difficult as change people. The very last thing is there's a couple of links there with some additional stories. And I know Alejandra has a few workshops coming up in the area as well. So you can go to that link and you can find that list. But there's lots of other stories that are very similar to this. And I guess the last thing I'll say to close off is I had someone who took the workshop 6 months ago come and visit my workshop class this week, just to say, you took the course 6 months ago. What's something that stood out for you? And she said, being a change agent means being okay with nervousness. You should always feel a little nervous when you're doing change work, because then your brain is really turned on. Your brain is really thinking about the best way to move these things forward. And if you're stuck in a status quo, you're missing something. So learn to live with the nervousness, which I thought was great. So I thought what we could do is, depending on what you guys have planned next, if there's some questions, we could do a quick Q&A. So I hope you like the ideas, and I'll make sure to send the slides over if you guys want copies of them as well.
¿Alguno quiere o decirle la pregunta directamente? Question?
Conversaciones efectivas o de comunicación, desarrollar dentro hace que sea. Pero si vemos la realidad de muchas organizaciones, bueno, y también de los clientes de ellos externalizan o compran sistemas o compran equipos de personas que dificulta tener como ese diálogo tan abierto o honesto, significativo para que debería ocurrir. O sea, personas que están, muchas veces personas que están de paso. Entonces, ¿cómo se puede lograr eso en un ambiente, por ejemplo, de consulta?
Well, they have a question about how you mix the communication or conversation with the people, like you talk in the slide a long time ago, and how you mix this with the you said co-create with mix with bills to buy something. How you handle, or in your experience with when you introduce in companies and outsourcing, or you use another company to try to change the stuff inside your company, how you mix this about your experience, how you handle that?
Usually, I like to try to find some kind of common ground or working agreement between the groups. And it's easier to establish that at the start of the engagement, especially if it's, you know, multiple companies or multiple consulting groups. So we know what to expect from each other. Setting expectations at the start really starts us in a good place.
I have another question. So you gave an example where all the management CEOs, everyone wants to be part of this change, but normally we have the opposite scenario where, in my case, for example, the company thinks or wants to be agile. Yes, the company wants to be agile, but what we are doing is working with the teams in an agile way, but the management is really not, they like to say they are working in an agile way, but they are not buying it that well. So where would you start with them?
Part of it could be that they, you know, the easy answer is to say that they're afraid of what they're going to lose because of Agile. So if their team's self-organized, then they might think, well, what's going to happen to me as a manager? What I see to be the most common is that the managers aren't included in the conversations. So the change people or the coaches work with the teams before they even have a conversation with the managers, or the managers don't have a choice. You know, the people at the top say, hey, we're bringing these coaches in to help us move towards Agile, and they don't give the managers the opportunity to be involved in that co-creation. So yeah, I think it's important to offer to the managers to help them too. Or, you know, in extreme cases, if the managers are appearing to be resistant, leave their teams alone. There was a guy in Sweden who said he was in the exact same spot, and he was assigned to help make the managers more agile in addition to the teams, and none of the managers were showing up to any of these weekly sessions. So he just said to them, he said, okay, this doesn't seem like the right time. I'm going to focus my energy on the teams. If you want any help or support, or you want to jump in, send me an email, but I'm going to go back and focus my energy on the teams. So it could just be a case of the managers just feeling like they're left out of the process.
Hi, Jason.
Hi.
Hi. And I have a question about centralized and decentralized information, decisions, agreements between teams, between executive. How is your experience about it?
Could you ask that again?
When you take, by example, I have teams that work decentralized and they take his own decisions, but I have executive or I have an office, an agile office that have some agreements, playbooks, I don't know, good practice and everything else. How do you manage this?
If you've heard of delegation poker from Management 3.0, that is something that I like to use to decide how much autonomy the teams have and from who. And it also depends, if there is that COE. I've worked with some COEs where they kind of act as guides. So they have a playbook, but it's not prescriptive. It's basically, here's a bunch of ideas you can look at, and you're free to pick and choose whichever ones you want. So I'd have a conversation around that. Is it a case of, just a misinterpretation about how much autonomy the teams have? But delegation poker is something that works really well, so we can at least establish the boundaries.
Your question? ¿Otra pregunta? ¿No? Pero un aplauso